Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you to my History Reaction channel. Today, we're going to be taking a look at what it was like to be poor in every time period by Trust Me Below. As always, I will include a link to the original content in the description down below. I highly encourage folks to head over to Trust Me Bro and show them some appreciation for this video if you like what you see here. Want to support our original content creators. Alright, so recently in one of my other videos that I reacted to, specifically Irish potato famine, I discuss one of the areas that I find interesting is the life of the common people. In other words, the people that aren't the movers and shakers of any given place or period during historical events, or through history in general for that matter. And then I was looking for more videos to react to, and I saw this one by Trust Me Bro, what it was like to be poor in every time period. And I thought this would be a good follow-up on what I was talking about in the Irish potato famine. So let's take a look through history at what it was like to be in the bottom masses at various periods in history. Now, talking about time periods, he's not making any statement here so far anyway on geography. I expect it will be primarily Western-centric. In other words, I doubt we're going to see a lot of discussion about Africa or Asia. He might surprise me, but given the length of the video, I kind of doubt it. So I expect it will be very Eurocentric or Americentric later on, and I suspect we're going to see a lot of generalities. So I'll try to add what I can as we go along. So let's just get in this, have some fun, and let's take a look at history from the bottom side instead of where most history videos and historians and history buffs tend to look, which is big movers and shakers, the big names, big battles, the big event. Let's take a look at other aspects of history, like what it was like to be the common person. Various eras throughout history. Here we go.
What it was like to be poor in every time period. You guys absolutely loved my video about being
I know what it's like to be poor in this time period.
Rich in every time period, so I thought I'd cover the opposite. Let's begin.
Yes.
The Stone Age. The Stone Age is actually quite interesting when it comes to poverty, simply because some would argue that it really wasn't a thing, at least not in the way that we consider it to be now. In the Stone Age, hunter and gatherer tribes were not uncommon, and these tribes often had little to no material possessions as they were nomadic, meaning that they lived off the land and traveled where the land was abundant. For a majority of this time, the richness of individuals in the Stone Age came from the land that they inhabited, meaning that if you were in a lush, fruitful area, you were wealthy. If you had access to water, a safe place to live, some sort of shelter, and access to wild animals, you were rich. This also meant that the opposite was true. If the land that you were living in had no access to water, shelter was sparse, you were exposed and vulnerable to predators and the elements, and food was hard to come by, you were poor. Very poor. Dangerously poor. In the Stone Age, poverty was a life or death situation because your wealth was your livelihood. Your wealth was food, shelter, and water, the essentials to life. With that being said, in the Stone Age, these humans were extremely in tune with nature and they were skilled at finding lush lands. And typically tribes had routes that they would follow during different seasons or different times of the year. They would follow the migrations of animals and also follow water. This brings me back to my original point. Did poverty not exist in the Stone Age? I don't think so. But it definitely was different. And what it looked like to be poor in the Stone Age was basically living off of land that provided nothing for you. The soil was dry and barren. There was no water to be found. There was no shelter. Animals were hard to come by. And no matter where you looked or traveled, you could not find suitable land. And like I mentioned...
So, I like all the Minecraft, by the way. That's a good summary, but it is overly general. When we're talking about hunter-gatherers, yeah, a lot of them were migratory or at the very least semi-migratory, depending on, like he said, the richness of the land. If you were in an area that could support a decent population, you were fairly rich, on to frame it that way. Whereas if you lived in an area where resources were rare, again, yeah, I can see what he's saying there. You're somewhat poor. But why I say this is a generality is because with the fully migratory bands, the ones that were pretty much nomadic more or less all the time. They may camp for a week or two here or there or whatever, but never stayed for like wintering in an area or seasonal migration, if we want to put it that way. Those people had to carry everything they owned with them. Personal possessions were going to be rare and they were going to be utilitarian. You're not going to carry around something just because you think it looks pretty, because it's really small anyway, a trinket. Can't. Most of these people at this period, if we're talking prehistoric Stone Age, a lot of them are not going to have beasts of burden to carry. Let's take a look at, like, for example, Native Americans. Here in North America, they would have had dogs help carry their stuff, but that's about it. Everything else they only had to carry themselves. So unless it was crucial to your survival, you're probably going to leave it behind. So individual wealth is not really a thing on a general broad level. Certain individuals would have things that others might covet, but it would be fairly limited in scope. Now, later on, Stone Age cultures, for example, here in the Americas, where we had Native Americans were still largely using Stone Age technology, some of them would get semi-sedentary. They would sometimes be able to stay in one area for for a prolonged period of time before moving on, or going, for example, out into the plains to hunt buffalo for the hunting season and then come back to a semi-permanent village. Then we're kind of talking about something, but nomadic early Stone Age tribe, yeah, they were largely almost communistic. Nobody really had private ownership of anything. Everything that you carried with you belonged to the village as a whole, typically, or the community as a whole. But he needed it, shared what you had because you needed what they had. There was no real concept of private ownership, with a few notable exceptions, and there's always going to be exceptions. So let's continue. See what's next.
Mentioned in the first
Because I'm going to start rambling soon.
Video, being rich in every time period, the Stone Age did heavily depend on the group that you were in. So let's say your tribe abandoned you in this land that was not fruitful. Then you'd be really poor, aka dead. The Bronze Age. No, just kidding. Like I mentioned in the last video, the Bronze Age is where massive technological advancements started to take place. Specifically, the introduction of bronze, which is an alloy made of 88% copper and 12% tin, which is why we're showing copper on screen. During the
So, that's the general rule of thumb, 8812, for modern copper, or excuse me, modern bronze. But it depends on what you're using it for. Different purposes may require more or less tin in relation to bronze. For example, bronze bells typically require more tin. They didn't always just use tin also. Sometimes they used, especially early on, arsenic of all things. Wasn't even always tin. Let's continue, but I got a lot more to say, I think, on the Bronze Age.
Bronze Age, wealth was associated with the production and the control of bronze, the knowledge of being able to craft tools out of bronze, and also becoming active in trade with the bronze creations that you're making, whether they be tools, weapons, or ornaments. Societies were growing, and that meant trade was growing, and social status also started to show itself. Now, with this being said, what did it look like to be poor in the Bronze Age? Well, for starters, obviously you had no knowledge of tool creation whatsoever. You couldn't make a tool if you tried. You had absolutely no access to bronze or any sort of copper or tin deposits. You were not engaged in trade whatsoever, and you simply lived off of your own goods. Now, this actually brings me to an interesting point that I want to make, because it's important that we understand poverty within its cultural and historical context. What I mean by this is, sure, it's easy from us with a modern day perspective to look at somebody without resources or access to advanced tools or trade to be considered poor, but if we look at the context of the time, it is really not uncommon to be completely self-sufficient, and that was for the most part a way of life. Everyone made their own food, tended to their own farm, raised their own livestock, and being self-sufficient wasn't an option. It was a necessity. Although someone may appear to be impoverished because they don't have access to bronze during the Bronze Age, you could still live a great life if you were self-sufficient, built your own home, lived in a nice area, either near or far from society. It's just an interesting point, because what we would potentially consider being poor, somebody with no access to advanced technologies or trade, was actually more than fine. The people that we may label as poor in this time were doing completely fine and potentially even even happier. Now, with that being said, if this person was really poor, and I mean really, really poor, they didn't have anything at all, meaning that not only did they have no tools, no skills, no access to bronze, they also didn't have any skills to make their own home. They didn't have a shelter to call their own. They couldn't live off of the land for whatever reason. And these people likely lived off of others and likely didn't live long either. At this point in time, being self-sufficient was very much a way of life. And if you couldn't take care of yourself, you weren't living long. The iron.
Okay, let's clarify on that a little bit. So let's start with the self-sufficiency thing. Conceptually, that's kind of accurate. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be self-sufficient. I would broaden that to include family units, clans, potentially villages, especially when we get a little bit further into this period and further into history. A lot of villages, when you start getting villages actually forming, are going to be like little communes in and of themselves, where most people are subsistence farmers or otherwise, on an individual sense, more or less self-sufficient, but you're also going to see a lot of cooperation among people in that community. So whether it's a village, whether it's a band of semi-nomadic peoples, or whatever you're talking about. So you're going to see, you don't have to be fully self-sufficient, I guess what I'm saying. You are going to have members of a community or a family that are going to be helping you, and you are expected to be helping them. You may have, especially again a little later than this, but even in this period, you're going to have things like communal grazing areas. You may have communal working areas where, for example, women would get together and do a lot of work as a group where they could benefit from each other's presence. Construction of homes or sheds or barns or stables or mangers or whatever you want to talk about there. You're going to see a lot of times that everybody is kind of expected to pitch in and help everybody else when this kind of thing happens. And this is overgeneralization. Some areas you're going to see this, some areas you may not. Cultures may have varying degrees of this. But when you say self-sufficient, that's true to a degree, but there's also often communal assistance as well. And with Bronze Age, I kind of keep coming back to those who have and have not in terms of possessing bronze. Trade and bronze came kind of hand in hand. Tin deposits especially. Copper is relatively rare. Tin is even rarer, especially at this time, especially if we're talking about European primarily or up to the Middle East cultures. And it's pretty unlikely you're going to find both together. So that's one reason why in the Bronze Age you're going to see an increase in trade networks. There's a lot of reasons, but one reason is if you want bronze, you may have copper deposits in the area where you live, but you may have no tin. You may have tin, but you may not have any copper. So the Bronze Age, it's kind of, once that technology out there to make bronze, it kind of incentivizes trade. It incentivizes little exploration, communicating with other groups, alliances, making treaties, making trade agreements. Because the Bronze Age, the defining characteristic of it, bronze, is something that very few are ever going to get without having some kind of trade going. So that's something else I think we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the Bronze Age and wealth. Because bronze, they're not likely to be able to make it unless you're trading with or one or the other components of it. And that's what's going to make the Iron Age very different. Let's see what he got to say about it.
Iron Age. The Iron Age picks up where the Bronze Age left off, but with a new metal, iron. Iron was more readily available and also easier to forge and work with. Iron tools, weapons.
No, that second part's not accurate. Iron isn't really any easier to work than bronze. some ways it's actually harder, especially if you're wanting to make good iron equipment, uh, and certainly for steel. Bronze is probably actually work with, but iron is much more plentiful, and the materials that you need to make iron or steel tools later on are much more plentiful, because we're talking carbon, iron and carbon, or some other materials as well, but those are two big ones. Carbon you can get pretty easy, so you just have to find the iron, and iron is more plentiful. You're less likely to have to trade for it, and when you do have to trade for it because it's more plentiful, it's uh, cheaper when you're doing your trading. So that's the big advantage of iron. It's not that it's easier to work with, it's that it's much more readily available.
And armor became the norm. And like the Bronze Age, association with the production, mining, and forging of this metal caused significant wealth, especially when paired with trade. Oh yeah, and in the Iron Age, trade, civilization, social class, and other factors all began to scale as well. Civilization was really starting to hit a stride here. And with this continued growth and scale of society, we saw the beginning of economics, employment, and a bit of what we would consider to be modern poverty. Being poor in the Iron Age typically meant you worked hard labor. You had basic living conditions and struggled to survive. Poor people in the Iron Age typically lived in simple, cramped huts made from wood, thatch, and mud, and their diet was relatively basic, consisting primarily of grains and vegetables, with meat being more or less of a luxury. Agriculture was still huge, but at this point, with employment now becoming the norm, these people were not working on their own farms, they worked on others' farms for a low wage. These impoverished people had long, demanding hours and wore clothes that were rudimentary and coarse. And like I mentioned, with the growth of society came more social status, and unfortunately, the poor got the short end of the stick there. The poor had low social status, limited rights, and were often heavily taxed by their local rulers. Now, despite all of the negatives in the life of the poor during the Iron Age, there was still a silver lining. Larger communities meant stronger community ties. There was more tradition that was being shared around, and religious practices also provided hope and support to those who lived these hard lives. You'll notice a trend of the more we see society evolve, we'll also see poverty become more common, because people are typically taken out of the self-sustaining lifestyle and put into a lifestyle where their livelihood is based off of working for others. This really makes you think, but I'll share my general consensus at the end of the video. The Middle Age.
Okay, so let's talk about the Iron Age as opposed to the Middle Ages, because we're still kind of talking about iron here, but what he said is overall accurate, with a few caveats that jumped out at me. When he said meat was scarce for the poorest, that depends on culture and the location, and what you define as meat, I guess, to some degree. Fish was a common staple in many areas around the world, but even in, and like I said, he's primarily speaking Eurocentric, so I'll try to stay in that arena as well. But there were several communities that had a pretty heavy reliance on fishing, or would often have things like fish soup, meals made from fish. So yeah, you're not going to see a lot of people eat beef. As we get closer to the medieval ages, start getting closer to ideas of like feudalism and so on, where other people own the land and you're only allowed to work it. May see things like hunting restriction, the king here, that concept. Local lord probably doesn't want you hunting his game. So yeah, there's going to be dietary issues. Grain bread is going to be a common one, like he said, but and fruits and vegetables. But the idea of no being less common or rare, again, that depends on considering meat. Seafood, fish was pretty common in meat. Also, dairy, pretty common in some areas, whether it be cow milk, goat milk, or other. Trying to think. led to the Iron Age up to the medieval. He kind of talks about how things are changing and how we're starting to get class differentiation as working for yourself and more working for somebody else. A lot of that has to do more with development of agriculture than advances in like iron technology. I don't think he meant to imply that it was iron, but because he kept emphasizing the Iron Age and availability of iron and so on, I just wanted to make it clear. A lot of that has more to do with advances in agriculture. As you've got people who were able to grow more food than they need just for themselves, which was kind of the life further back, a little bit extra for others. Now you're getting where people growing themselves and plus many others, you can start getting specialists, priests, government officials, uh, and our military you can support, things like that, traders, merchant class. But it takes a good, strong agricultural base for that kind of stuff to develop. And once that starts to develop, then you're gonna start getting more of a class structure. So I just kind of wanted to make sure that there was just implied, as he didn't specify that, it kind of felt more like he was implying that iron was the driving force of this period. And no, it was what we used to label the period was a major advancement in the period, but so was agriculture. Agriculture was really taking off in it, and that made a big difference in how society was formed and how it was structured. And it does create more of this class distinction. The poor, middle, and the upper class, or however you want to structure it.
Or the medieval era. By this point, I think it's important we make another note. By modern standards, even the wealthiest of wealthy during the Middle Ages were not living amazing lives. The wealthy did, of course, enjoy better clothing, better housing, more food compared to the poor, but they had nowhere near the modern luxuries that a modern-day homeless person has access to. It's important to note that the Middle Ages was triggered by the fall of Rome, leaving a massive power vacuum and a huge opportunity for new management across all of Europe. And within that, two powers arose: the church and the royal families. I mention this because at the time, the centralization of power was very tight-knit, meaning that if you were not associated with the royal family or the church, your access to wealth was minimal, and almost everybody at this time was poor, or in context of the Middle Ages, a serf. And no, not internet surfing or the cool water surfing. No, we're talking about hard manual labor poverty surfing. Not fun. So to answer the question, what was it like to be poor in the Middle Ages? Well, kind of similar to before. You had limited legal rights, limited access to knowledge, limited freedom, limited resources. Your housing was small and pitiful. Your meals were barely sufficient. Your days consisted of hard manual labor, typically under the threat of violence if performance is subpar. And overall, it wasn't a great time. But like every part of history, if you have good friends, it can make a hard time an okay time. And just maybe, even a good time. Yeah, friendship is magic. Yeah, no, I don't know. It would suck to be poor then, for sure. The early...
Okay, so that was an overgeneralization. Broad strokes, probably not too bad, but different areas and different period within what we would think of as a medieval period are going to have very different systems in how their serfs are treated. And what rights they might have had, what property rights they might have had, what freedom they might have had, can vary quite a bit across that period of time as well as by region. So that was an overgeneralization to say the least. Some serfs, I mean, yes, serfs would have been down at the bottom rung for most areas, but how far down that was kind of depend on where and when you are exactly. For example, certain areas you might have, instead of serfs, you might have burghers, people who live in villages and had some pretty decent rights, but they were still lower class. They were still poor. But they had more rights and potentially more education than, say, in some other areas. And let's consider, for example, the Russian serfs. At this period, they probably have more rights, freedoms than they're going to have in the early modern era. Because starting in the 1500s, all the way up into the 1800s, they're going to see their rights being stripped piece by piece, until they're essentially slaves. So where they are in the medieval period is, as bad as it might seem, us looking back, or even them at their time, still way better than it's going to be for their descendants. So there's a lot of context and nuance in um, looking at stuff like this.
Modern era. As we discussed previously, in the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. We saw early globalization, economies grow, and we saw the development of the societies that we live in today. Life for the poor didn't shift much except for one interesting opportunity. Like the medieval era, in the early modern era, the poor still lived relatively similarly. Cramped, unsanitary conditions, limited access to proper housing and healthcare, basic diets consisting primarily of bread, grains, and very little meat. Poor people faced grueling, low-paying jobs in agriculture and manual work. Poor people had limited rights and were still taxed heavily. And at this point, still, education was scarce, perpetuating the socioeconomic disadvantages that they experienced. It's hard to do better if you don't know better, or even anything else. But similarly to before, in these hard times, these poor people had their boys, they had their religion, and now they also saw a light at the end of the tunnel. The society that they were living in was growing and expanding to the point where opportunities started to present themselves, and people started to have larger ambitions as they saw opportunities for themselves to level up their position in life and create just a little bit of wealth for themselves to enjoy some sort of modern comfort. Consider
I'm going to stop him right there. So some of the things he said were kind of repeats of what he had said previously in the medieval period. I have the same comments on those, that kind of overgeneralizing. The diet thing again, there's still going to be places that are going to, where meat would be a regular thing in the diet of the poorest, but it'll probably be fish, or fish is going to be the most common on the poor level, but you will see that in regions that have good access to fish. Russia comes to mind again. I know that one a little better. Or fish was a major food source for a lot of the poor in that region, at least in areas that had access to good supplies of fish. They had a million different varieties of fish soups available, for example. And there were other cultures as well. Ireland had quite a few fish, although only, again, in certain areas was it something that was a significant part of the diet. And later on, there's economic changes that are going to cause problems with Irish access. But we talked about a lot of that Irish potato famine video, which is one that I did that inspired me to look at this one. So if you want to know a little bit more about that, you might see that video. The Irish people got pushed further and further into a very, very specific diet, but that's the exception rule by far. Else, yeah, living conditions are getting more crowded. This period, you're going to start seeing increases in urbanization. It's going to really take off with the Industrial Revolution. But at this stage, you're already starting to see increases in urbanization. Start seeing increasing problems with disease, with hygiene, with sanitary conditions, sanitization. Because when you start gathering a lot of people in one area, you're making it easier to spread disease. You're also creating more waste products of various types, and especially in this earlier period, the infrastructure to remove waste urban area aren't really in place yet, nor is the understanding of what's causing some of the problems. See a lot of health issues, especially among the poor, but even among the rich, because they live in those areas too. That's These doesn't necessarily respect social class or wealth, especially in a time period like this. Just re just it more respect how crowded you are and sanitary conditions of the area you live. Urban areas where you're generally gonna see the elite, and so they're gonna be just as vulnerable as poor. They just might be in a better position to care for themselves, but
This early capitalism. Just picture it. You're hanging out with your boys. You just finished a 12-hour unpaid shift of getting your legs crushed by horses in the cornfields, or whatever they did. And you guys are talking about religion, and you're hanging out, and you're drinking ale. And then all of a sudden, one of your buddies says, hey, what if we go on one of these explorations? One of these guys is looking for crewmates on his ship, and he wants to go colonize Madagascar. He says he wants to film a movie about talking animals from the zoo. That's what they had back then. At that point, that was a possibility, and the riches from that exploration and the profit from that movie, which did do well, could change their lives forever.
Okay, let's comment briefly on that because that's somewhat true, but also a little misleading. Early colonization was a game for the rich, not for the poor. It was a way to better yourself, yes, if you were from a wealthy elite class, typically. The first settlers in Jamestown, Virginia were not the poor, they were the wealthier individuals looking to find gold and make themselves richer. The Spanish conquistadors largely came from Hidalgo class, lesser nobles, or other kind of like knights. They might bring their servants with them, so the poor might come, but early exploration, pretty much a rich man, or at least a better off man, came. The poor just didn't really have the incentive early on. Yeah, you could argue better life, possibly, but that wasn't a good argument to really make because they still would have been subject of the crown, and the crown is going to determine who gets what. Who gets what is going to church, the state, and whatever nobleman is leading the expedition, or whatever nobles are leading. It's not going to be the common people that they might bring with them to help them out in the end. A lot of the early explorers are going to second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth sons of wealthy nobles or wealthy merchants, wealthier middle class families that have no prospect at home because their elder brothers are going to inherit everything. So they've got a choice of going into the military, get something for themselves, or going on some of the exploration to maybe finding gold or maybe even potentially earning some land for themselves. Now, a little later, start getting into the 17th century, start getting some of the explorations are kind of already done, and you have governments looking for ways to improve their colonies. Then you might see incentives being put in place to encourage the poor to, or at least things like farmers, you know what I'm saying, to move over to these new colonies. And we'll use again Jamestown as an example. First arrivals were primarily fairly wealthy compared to later. They were mostly looking for gold, riches like the Spanish were getting. Once they realized that that wasn't going to happen, they still didn't want to give up their colony because yet the Europeans were starting to colonize, and you had to get your foot in the door regardless. So you start seeing Virginia Company trying to encourage farmers and so on to move over. But until they get a cash crop, in the case of Jamestown, we're talking tobacco, the pull isn't that strong. once you get a cash crop, more the wealthy traders are starting to come over, but it's still not enough to make a go of it. They still got to get more people over. But the problem is it's expensive to move people, especially when a lot of them are going to die off. That's where you get things like the indentured servitude system, the headright system, specifically in Jamestown, where wealthier individuals could pay somebody else's passage over, pay some farmers, work their fields, and in exchange, after a certain period of time, those workers that they brought over would get their own land once they paid off the price of their ticket. So that's when you start seeing some of the poor people. It wasn't something that happened until there was incentives put in place and allowances made for this to be possible in some cases. Spanish primarily tried to use Native American labor. So you had the wealthier upper class individuals come over, and they were hoping to make a go of it using slave labor from the local natives. But those natives started dying off from disease, and they realized that's not going to work. So they start bringing over African slaves, but they also start bringing over, just like Jamestown, Spanish lower class individuals to do the menial labor for them. But it doesn't necessarily mean they get a better situation. At least not in every example. Depends on the country you're talking about and what rules they might have had in place in terms of what rights colonists might have. Of whatever colonial government is, but also crown that runs oversee colonial government. So it's a lot more complicated. But it wasn't necessarily a way to better yourself. Sometimes all you were doing was moving point A to point B, the exact same, or even worse circumstance. Because sometimes colonial endeavors gave you less rights than you would have had back at home.
The modern era and present day. If you want to see poverty in the present day, it's not hard to find. Simply open your phone, go to the camera app, and turn on the forward-facing camera, and there you go. You're looking at a poor person. Jokes aside, I would be lying if I said that the poverty experienced in the modern era is really much different than any other era. Now, of course, throughout history, access to information, medical care, housing, knowledge, and so many more factors have improved exponentially in the background, and this improvement has affected everybody positively. You know, a rising tide lifts all boats. But the experience that the poor people have always been similar. Limited rights, limited knowledge, limited opportunities, low wages, and a subpar experience, to say the least. One thing that I want to bring up that I kind of mentioned in the Stone Age is that in the modern day, poverty is really only associated with net worth and money that you have. But if you lived completely off-grid, had everything you needed, and were self-sustaining, if you could support yourself, eat, live, do what you wanted to do on your own time, in your own land, and had $0 in the bank, would it matter? Would you need that money? Would that monetary wealth mean anything to you? If you think about it, the monetary wealth that we have today only is used as a tool to provide us with the luxuries we need to live. We pay for shelter, we pay for food, we pay for water, we pay for protection, we pay for infrastructure in the form of taxes. Wealth has always been about survival, and the only difference is how survival looks with the development of society. I find it interesting that the introduction of poverty really only came around when we started to stray away from self-sufficiency and living off of the land and being independent as people. Now, I could be missing a ton of context, and this isn't necessarily a fact. This is just a theory I've come to as I've been making this video, but I really do find the concept fascinating that if you just live off the land self-sustaining, poverty really doesn't exist because you are forced to live. That is your biological makeup. Think about the animal kingdom. There is no such thing as a poor animal. There's no measure of that. There's only an alive or a dead animal. It's interesting. Might be more of a shower or stoner thought, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about. If you haven't seen the Being Rich in Every Era video, check it out now. And if you want a quick summary of both videos just for fun, here's the conclusion that I've come to. Wealth has always been about survival, and as it evolved, it transitioned to also include power. And I would still consider power to be part of survival, because not only are you surviving to stay alive, you're also trying trying to allow your power to survive. And on the other side of the coin, poverty has always been the same. Lack, severe lack of resources, lack of knowledge, lack of tools, lack of skill, lack of rights. But I think what I've learned over this video and the last is that to solve homelessness, what we need to do is give every homeless person access to Minecraft for, let's say, 2 weeks. Let them play Minecraft for 2 weeks, and then we'll just say, hey, now do this in real life and you'll be all right. Totally joking, but it's interesting to think that if you just have skills to be self-sustaining and live off land, money has no use. And yes, I know, well, how are you gonna get the land? How do you live off the land if you have no money, you have no land? Well, here's what we'll do. All the homeless people playing Minecraft, we're gonna live stream it. And the people that donate, that money will go towards buying the land, which we can allow them to plunder and build upon. Maybe not plunder, I think that's the wrong word, but live upon and bask and frolic, you know? Why not? I'm obviously being extremely satirical, and homelessness is a very complex issue that deals a lot with drug abuse and mental health, among other factors. But it's just a funny thought. Yes. Editor's note, but I read the comments. There's just so many timelines going on at once. I made this video as extremely general as possible. This is a Trust Me Bro video, not a documentary. You know what you're watching. Just enjoy and kind of take out what you can. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and like always, trust me, bro.
All right. Not too bad, not too bad. At least he acknowledges that he was doing general overviews, which I expected. Like I said, when we went into this, it's fairly short, so going to be dealing in generalities. There's no way could have been going into exceptions and nuance on such a short video, so I fully expected that. So the modern age and the things that he observed, I think the only thing I'm going to throw in there, and most of what everything else I'd want to say I've covered in the previous periods, is that there have been studies on happiness, especially relatively recently. Ever since the development of the idea of a science of psychiatry, there have been studies of what makes people depressed, what makes people homicidal, angry, what makes them all these negative things. But nobody had really done a lot. There wasn't really a major movement to study positive psychological traits like happiness. That has become more of a thing in recent years, a couple of decades, I would say. And one thing that they have discovered in studying this is that happiness is not necessarily measured by how wealthy you are. Some of the richest people in the world can be extremely unhappy, while some of the poorest people in the world be extremely happy. What's one thing that they did find, however, is that there is this threshold, if you want to call it that. Do you have what you to survive? That kind of ties into what Trust Me Bro is saying here. Do you have a place to live, a shelter over your head? Are you getting at least enough food to get by on? Not necessarily enough to be wasteful with it or eat more than you need or to have treats, so to speak. But do you have enough just to get by, to survive on and not feel miserable? And basically, do you have the essentials to survive comfortably? By that I mean not really truly suffering in terms of always constantly hungry or having a, but just reasonably comfortably. You're not going to necessarily have any luxury to speak of, but you've got enough of the essentials that get through the day without feeling miserable. That's a threshold. And if you're below that, there is a big drop off in happiness. Okay, people below that tend to get miserable. Once you get to, and there's a huge spike in happiness as you go up towards that. Once you get past that point, studies show that happiness is much more of a gentle sloping. In other words, having more than you need, it doesn't necessarily increase your happiness that much. And part of that is because Happiness after that point tends to be tied to perception, what you think you should have, or a personality type. There are people who always are going to want more. And those people are never going to be happy because no matter how high up they get on that totem pole, they're going to want more. Those people are never really going to be happy because there's no end to their finish line. But there's also, like I said, there is a point you reach where more is nice and it'll slightly increase your happiness level. But that threshold of, do you have enough to live reasonably, not with any kind of luxury? Once you hit that point, the increase in happiness for most people is fairly flat compared to getting up to that point. So in the modern period, true poverty, as in people who are below that level, has steadily decreased over the past couple hundred years since the Industrial Revolution. So we still have poor people, but compared to the past, not even close comparison. The standard of living for the poorest among us has elevated substantially. There are still people below that, don't get me wrong, but globally speaking, the poorest, the baseline poor, we'll put it that way, now are much higher than the baseline poor were in the past. However, again, once you reach a certain point, how much that benefits you in terms of actual happiness, it depends on your personality type and culture and your expectations, what you think you did, more than any actual objective reality. Plenty of people can be extremely happy just having enough of them and their family to get by. Find happiness where you look for it, as long as you're not driven by that pursuit. I hope that makes sense. There's actually a good documentary on it called Happy. It's actually pretty interesting to watch. I don't know if it's even available now, but I remember seeing it a long time ago because when it came out, a lot of people were telling me, "Hey, you got to see this because it's all about you." Because Happy, but so I did see it, and it was actually quite interesting. But I have also read some psychological studies on the kind of thing, and it was kind of interesting. So trust me, bro's not exactly wrong what he was talking about. Yet it was his opinion, but at least when I was reading up on this stuff, the psychological study on happiness kind of agreed with him. As long as you can support yourself, or by extension, family if you have one, as long as you've got enough to reasonably get by, you can be pretty darn happy if you want to be. If you just let yourself be happy. Anyway, getting rambly again, so let's just call it good right here. Um, Good overview for Western civilization, and yeah, it was kind of interesting to look at. So I enjoyed it. Um, I took it for what it was, which was overview. Fine, but it's an area that I think folks should consider diving into more. How society has evolved, how class structures have evolved in different areas. They're not even remotely close to you, even across what we would now think of as a country. Um, some areas, for example, in the Germanic states, Holy Roman Empire, might be very different idea of a peasant or a serf. Other areas, states, what we think of now as Germany. So context matters, location matters, specific periods of time, much more narrowly defined. Anyway, I'll see y'all next time. Bye bye.